My daughter decided I wasn't good enough for her new world. She told me not to come to the product launch for the company I helped her build. For the first time, I didn't argue. I just packed a small bag and drove toward the mountains. By sunset, my phone began to vibrate nonstop. Dozens of calls from investors. Something terrible had happened. But before that moment, the day had already been cruel in small, ordinary ways. Her name is Clara Whitfield, 34 years old, CEO of Nova Dynamics, one of the fastest growing artificial intelligence startups in San Francisco. And I'm her mother, Julia Whitfield, a former engineer who co-founded the company from my garage 6 years ago, before Clara's investors decided an aging female co-founder didn't fit the image they wanted to project to the world. They wanted youth. They wanted sleek presentations. They wanted someone who looked like they belonged on magazine covers and TED Talk stages. I was 56, practical, and far too honest about the limitations of our technology, so they eased me out with a generous settlement and a non-disclosure agreement that felt like hush money. Clara had always been brilliant. Even as a child, she could see patterns where others saw chaos. She taught herself to code at 12, built her first app at 15, graduated from Stanford at 20 with honors that made me cry with pride. She was ambitious in ways I never was, hungry for something I couldn't quite name, but lately she'd become someone I barely recognized. Polished, impatient, constantly quoting her fiancé, Ethan Vale, a venture capitalist with a perfect smile and an even more perfect contempt for people like me. People who still believed that good work mattered more than good optics. The morning of the video call, I'd been working in my home office in Oakland, reviewing security protocols for a nonprofit organization that couldn't afford the kind of corporate rates Nova Dynamics now charged. The work was meaningful, if not particularly glamorous. My phone rang at exactly 9:30, which meant Clara had scheduled it between meetings. Everything in her life ran on a schedule now. Her face appeared on screen, backlit by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office. Behind her, the San Francisco skyline glittered like a promise. She wore a cream blazer I knew cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that made her look older, more authoritative. More like the kind of CEO investors wanted to believe in. "Mom, about Friday's launch gala," she began, her tone clipped and businesslike, as if I were a vendor she needed to manage, rather than the woman who'd sat up with her through countless sleepless nights debugging code and dreaming impossible dreams. I already knew what was coming. I'd felt it building for months, in the increasingly brief phone calls, in the way she'd stopped asking my opinion about technical decisions, in how she'd started referring to the company as hers rather than ours. "We're repositioning the guest list," she continued, not quite meeting my eyes through the camera. "Making it more exclusive, more focused on current stakeholders and strategic partners. Ethan thinks it's important that we control the narrative, especially with the Series C announcement coming up." I waited, giving her the space to say what she needed to say. "The thing is, Mom, some of the investors have concerns about mixed messaging, about people wondering why someone who's no longer actively involved in the company's direction would be prominently featured at our signature event." Translation: they didn't want the old lady who used to run things from her garage standing around reminding people that Nova Dynamics had humble, unglamorous origins. "I see," I said quietly. "It's not personal," Clara added quickly, though we both knew that made it worse, not better. "It's just business. You understand business, Mom. You taught me that." I wanted to remind her what else I'd taught her. That integrity wasn't negotiable. That the people who helped you climb the ladder deserved your loyalty. That success built on shame was just a prettier kind of failure. But I could see in her face that she'd already made her decision, already justified it to herself with whatever logic Ethan had provided. "Have a wonderful evening, darling," I said, and logged off before she'd see the tears I refused to let fall. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the blank screen. Outside my window, the Oakland neighborhood hummed with ordinary life. People walking dogs, kids riding bikes, someone practicing saxophone badly in an apartment down the street. Real life, messy and unpolished and honest. Then I stood up, packed a small overnight bag, and drove east. The cabin near Lake Tahoe had been my refuge for years, purchased during the brief window when Nova Dynamics money made such indulgences possible. Clara had visited exactly twice. The first time, she'd spent the whole weekend on her phone, complaining about the unreliable Wi-Fi. The second time, she'd brought Ethan, who'd spent exactly 45 minutes there before announcing that he couldn't relax in places that felt aggressively rustic. They'd left before dinner, Clara apologizing in a way that suggested she agreed with him. I loved it precisely because it was aggressively rustic. The cabin was small, weathered, surrounded by pines that whispered secrets when the wind moved through them. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and old books. There was no television, no smart home devices, nothing that beeped or buzzed or demanded my attention. Just silence and space, and the kind of peace that only comes from being completely alone with yourself. I arrived just before sunset, the sky turning that particular shade of orange, gold that makes everything look forgiven. I made tea, sat on the porch, and watched the light fade over the mountains. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax, felt something unknot in my chest. My phone sat on the table beside me, deliberately silenced. I'd turned off all notifications except for emergency calls from my elderly mother in Portland and my sister in Chicago. Everyone else could wait. I didn't think about Clara, or about the gala happening in 3 days, or about the company I'd built from nothing and then lost to people who valued presentation over substance. I just sat there, breathing, existing without purpose or productivity or strategic planning. By nightfall, I'd made dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market I'd stopped at on the way out of Oakland. I ate slowly, tasting everything, not checking email between bites. I read for an hour, a mystery novel with no particular message or meaning, just entertainment. Then I went to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of wind in the trees and the absolute absence of city noise. I woke to my phone vibrating so violently it had walked itself halfway across the nightstand. The screen showed 32 missed calls, 17 text messages, 8 voicemails, all in the past 2 hours. My first thought was my mother. Emergency. Hospital. That sick lurch of fear that comes with pre-dawn phone calls. But the names on the screen weren't my sister or my mother's nursing home. They were Adam Chen, Nova Dynamics' chief operating officer; Melissa Torres, the head of engineering; David Kim, one of the original investors who'd always treated me with respect even after I was pushed out; 3 board members, 2 journalists, even Clara 5 times in the past hour. Something was very wrong. I played Adam's voicemail first, my hands trembling enough that I nearly dropped the phone. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Julia, it's Adam Chen. I know it's late. I know you're not officially part of the company anymore, but we have a situation. A serious situation. The product launched tonight, the demo, it collapsed, complete system failure mid-presentation, right in front of investors and press. The encryption layer failed, client data was exposed live on screen. Names, email addresses, some financial information. It's a disaster. Ethan's trying to blame the failure on legacy code, on architectural decisions made before he came on board. Your code, Julia. But the engineering team is saying that can't be right, that something else happened. We need you. We need someone who actually understands the foundational architecture. Please call me back. Please." I sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, my mind already racing through possibilities. The encryption layer, the security protocol I'd built personally, tested exhaustively, designed to be bulletproof precisely because I knew how catastrophic a breach would be. That code didn't just fail. Not on its own. I opened my laptop, my fingers moving on muscle memory. I still had access to the old Nova Dynamics server architecture through a backdoor I'd quietly maintained when I left. Not to spy, not to sabotage, just because I can quite let go of something I'd built with my own hands. Call it insurance, or paranoia, or a mother's inability to completely release something she'd created. The login credentials still worked. The board had meant to revoke all my access, but there were layers to the system that predated the current IT team, subsystems I'd built before we had the money for proper security audits. I'd never mentioned them during my exit, and apparently no one had thought to look. I navigated through the architecture, following the pathways I knew by heart, and there, in the foundational security layer, I found it. 3 months ago, someone had overwritten the core encryption protocols. My tested, redundant, unglamorous but utterly reliable code had been replaced with something newer, flashier, supposedly faster. The kind of code that looked impressive in presentations but hadn't been tested for the kind of load Nova Dynamics now handled. I dug deeper, following the digital fingerprints. The changes had been approved by Ethan Vale, implemented by a contracted development team from New York that specialized in rapid deployment and modern architecture. They'd bypassed every review protocol, every safety check, every redundancy I'd built in. Not because they were malicious, but because they didn't understand why those safeguards existed in the first place. They traded integrity for optics, security for speed, reliability for innovation theater. And tonight, in front of everyone who mattered to Clara's future, to the company's future, it had failed spectacularly. I sat there in the cabin's darkness, listening to the wind, feeling something cold and clear settle in my chest. Part of me wanted to stay here, safe and separate, let them figure out their own mess. They'd pushed me out, decided I wasn't good enough for their new world. Why should I rescue them now? But there was another part of me, the part that had built Nova Dynamics from nothing, that had spent sleepless nights ensuring every system was secure, every client protected. That part couldn't watch the company burn, couldn't let client data remain exposed, couldn't abandon the people, the real people, whose information was now vulnerable because someone valued presentation over protection. And there was Clara, my daughter, who'd made terrible choices, who'd hurt me, who'd chosen ambition over integrity. But who was still my daughter, still learning, still young enough to be shaped by failure into something better than success had made her. I made coffee, packed up my laptop, and started the 3-hour drive back to San Francisco through the night. The roads were empty, just me and the occasional truck driver, both of us moving through darkness toward uncertain destinations. I drove faster than I should have, my mind already working through the technical steps I'd need to take. Isolate the compromised systems, restore the original security architecture, patch the breach, ensure no ongoing data exposure. It would take hours, maybe days, and would require access I no longer technically had. But I knew people who'd been at Nova Dynamics before it became a unicorn startup. Before the venture capitalists arrived with their term sheets and their ideas about proper corporate structure. People who still believed in the mission we'd started with, making artificial intelligence systems that were actually intelligent, actually useful, actually trustworthy. I arrived at Nova Dynamics headquarters just before midnight. The building rose 32 stories of glass and steel, all of it lit up like a beacon of distress. News vans were parked outside, reporters doing stand-up shots with the building as a backdrop. Through the lobby windows, I could see chaos. People in evening wear, clearly guests from the failed gala, standing in clusters, some arguing, some on their phones. Security guards trying to maintain some semblance of order. Lawyers, I guessed, arriving to assess liability and damage control. I'd never been back here, not since the day I cleaned out my office and turned in my badge. Walking through those doors felt like stepping backward in time, except everything had changed. The lobby that used to display our original mission statement now featured a massive digital installation showing real-time company metrics and glowing press quotes. The receptionist I used to chat with about her evening classes had been replaced by a sleek young man in an expensive suit who clearly had no idea who I was. I'm here to see Adam Chen, I said. He's expecting me. The young man looked at me doubtfully. I was wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots. I looked like someone's mother, which I was, but not like someone who belonged in this building at midnight. Julia Whitfield. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. He made a call, spoke quietly, then looked at me with new uncertainty. Someone will be right down. Adam appeared within 2 minutes, looking like he'd aged 5 years in one evening. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled, his normally calm demeanor replaced by visible relief. Julia, thank God. Come up, please. We've got the engineering team in the war room, but honestly, nobody knows what to do. Ethan keeps insisting it's a simple rollback issue, but Melissa says it's more complicated than that. We rode the elevator in silence. Through the glass walls, I could see different floors, each one showing variations of the same scenic groups of people hunched over laptops, arguing, problem-solving, panicking. The war room was on the executive floor. I'd been in it exactly twice before I was pushed out, both times feeling like an intruder in a space designed for people who understood corporate politics better than I did. Now it was packed. Engineers, executives, board members, lawyers, and in the center of it all, Clara. She looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Her face went through several expressions at once: as shock, shame, relief, fear, something that might have been hope. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking on the single syllable. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to fix what you broke," I said quietly, not cruelly, just stating a fact. Ethan Vale stood up from his position at the head of the conference table. He was still in his tuxedo from the gala, though he'd lost the bow tie somewhere along the way. Even in crisis, he managed to look like he was posing for a photo shoot. "With all due respect, Julia, this is a current team issue. We have people handling it. Your people replaced my security architecture with something that failed catastrophically," I said, moving to an empty chair and opening my laptop. "Which means your people don't actually know what they're doing. Adam, I need root access to the main server cluster and administrative privileges on the security subnet." "She doesn't have clearance for that," Ethan started, but Adam was already typing on his phone. "She has it now," Adam said. "Julia, you're reinstated as an emergency consultant with full system access. Whatever you need." For the next 6 hours, I lived inside the code. Around me, the room continued its chaotic rhythm. Lawyers discussing liability. Board members arguing about whether to issue a press statement. Ethan trying to assign blame to anyone but himself. But I tuned it all out, descending into the pure logic of systems and protocols. The damage was worse than I'd initially thought. The new encryption layer hadn't just failed, it had cascaded through multiple systems, exposing not just the demonstration client data, but creating vulnerabilities in the entire customer database. Someone with sufficient skill and bad intentions could potentially access thousands of client files. I worked methodically, isolating compromised systems, rebuilding the security architecture from my original specifications, patching every exposed vulnerability. Melissa Torres, the head of engineering, worked beside me, following my lead, understanding what I was doing even when I didn't explain. She'd been one of my original hires, someone who valued substance over style, and I was glad to see she'd survived the company's transformation. Around 4 in the morning, Clara appeared at my elbow with coffee. She didn't say anything, just set it down and stood there, watching me work. "The encryption key rotation protocol," she said finally. "The one you taught me when I was first learning system security. You're rebuilding it." "It never should have been removed," I said, not looking up from my screen. "I didn't know they'd removed it." Ethan said the new architecture was more efficient, more modern. I trusted him. "You should have trusted the code." I finally looked at her. "Code doesn't lie to you, Clara. It doesn't have an agenda. It either works or it doesn't. People are the ones who lie." Her face crumpled slightly, but she held it together. I know that now. By dawn, the system was secure. Not perfect, not restored to its full functionality, but locked down tight enough that no additional damage could occur. Client data was protected. The vulnerabilities were patched. Nova Dynamics would survive. I sat back, my eyes burning, my back aching from hours hunched over a laptop. "It's done," I said. "You'll need to notify all affected clients, offer credit monitoring, issue a formal apology. And you need to rebuild the entire security infrastructure from the ground up. This is just a band-aid." The room, which had gradually filled with people as words spread that the crisis was being resolved, erupted in relieved conversation. Board members already strategizing about damage control. Lawyers discussing notification requirements. Engineers asking technical questions about what I'd done and how they could learn from it. Adam Chen stood up. "The board needs to meet immediately. Julia, please stay." I looked at Clara, who nodded. Ethan's face had gone pale. The emergency board meeting was brutal in its efficiency. I explained, in technical detail, what had happened. How the original security architecture had been systematically replaced. Who had approved the changes? What the consequences had been. When I finished, there was silence. Then David Kim, the investor who'd always treated me with respect, spoke. "I move that we reinstate Julia Whitfield as interim chief technology officer, effective immediately, with full authority over all technical architecture decisions." "Seconded," said another board member. The vote was unanimous. Even Clara voted yes, though she looked like she might be sick. Ethan stood up. "This is ridiculous. You're going to throw away months of modernization work because of one failure. Every system has failures. Every new architecture has growing pains." "Growing pains don't expose client data," David said coldly. "And modernization that sacrifices security isn't modernization. It's negligence. Your consulting relationship with Nova Dynamics is terminated, effective immediately. The company will be reviewing all architectural decisions made under your advisement." Ethan looked at Clara, waiting for her to defend him, to fight for him the way she'd fought to exclude her own mother from the gala. She looked back at him with something like recognition, like she was finally seeing him clearly, without the gloss of his confidence and his connections and his perfect smile. "I think you should go, Ethan," she said quietly. He stared at her for a long moment, then grabbed his jacket and walked out. Nobody stopped him. When the room cleared, it was just Clara and me. "I'm sorry," she said, and started crying, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and shameful and finally honest. "I was ashamed. Ashamed of you. Of how real you are. You're not polished. You don't say the right things in meetings. You don't care about looking successful. I thought if I looked successful enough, if I surrounded myself with the right people and said the right things and kept my distance from anything that seemed ordinary, nobody would remember where I came from. Nobody would remember that I started in a garage with a mom who wore flannel shirts and drove a 15-year-old Honda." I reached across the table and took her hand. "And where you came from was honesty, Clara. Where you came from was real work, real values, real relationships. Maybe it's time you remembered that." "I don't know if I know how anymore," she whispered. "Then it's a good thing you have time to learn." The weeks that followed were intense. I moved back into an office at Nova Dynamics, this time with clear authority and explicit board support. Clara and I worked side by side, rebuilding not just the technical infrastructure, but the company culture that had been slowly eroded by the chase for status and appearance. We brought back some of the old team members who'd been pushed out during the modernization. We instituted mandatory code review protocols. We slowed down, prioritized security over speed, chose reliability over flash. It wasn't glamorous. We lost some investors who wanted faster growth, more aggressive expansion. But we kept the ones who mattered, the ones who understood that sustainable success is built on solid foundations, not pretty presentations. Clara and I rebuilt our relationship too, slowly and carefully. There were difficult conversations, moments when old hurts surfaced, times when she struggled with the humiliation of her very public failure, and I struggled with my very private hurt at how easily she'd discarded me. But we kept showing up, kept working, kept being honest with each other, even when honesty was uncomfortable. One evening, 3 months after the crisis, we drove up to the cabin together. It was Clara's idea. She wanted to see it again, she said, but really see it this time, without Ethan's contempt in her ear, without the constant pull of her phone and her schedule and her need to appear successful. We arrived at sunset, the same golden light I'd seen the night of the gala. We made dinner together, simple and unhurried. We sat on the porch with coffee and watched the stars come out, brighter than they ever appeared in the city. "You know, Mom," Clara said quietly, "I almost lost everything trying to impress people who didn't care about me. People who only valued me when I was useful to them, when I made them look good or made them money. Then maybe losing them was the best thing that ever happened," I said. She smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in years. Turns out the things I was ashamed of, the ordinary real things, those were the only things worth keeping. We sat there for a long time, mother and daughter, no longer separated by shame or ambition or the false distance success can create. Later that night, as I was falling asleep in the cabin's small bedroom, I heard Clara on the porch, on the phone with someone from the office. But this time, her voice was different, confident but not arrogant, clear but not cold. "No," she was saying. "We're not going to rush that launch. I don't care what the timeline pressure is. We do it right, or we don't do it at all. That's not negotiable." I smiled in the darkness. The girl I raised was still in there, under all the polish and pressure. She just needed to fail spectacularly to remember who she actually was. Over the following months, Nova Dynamics stabilized and then began to grow again, but differently this time. We were more careful, more intentional, more honest about what we could and couldn't do. Clara became the kind of CEO I'd always hoped she could be, one who led with integrity rather than image, who valued her team over her optics. She broke up with Ethan officially, though he'd already moved on to another startup, another young CEO to advise and shape and eventually compromise. I saw his name in the tech press occasionally, always attached to some new venture, always promising disruption and transformation. I wondered if he ever thought about what he'd done to Nova Dynamics, if he ever connected his advice to the disaster it created. Probably not. People like Ethan rarely looked back long enough to learn from their failures. Clara started dating someone new eventually, a software engineer named Marcus, who worked at a competing company but shared her values about ethical AI development. He wore T-shirts with obscure programming jokes, drove a beat-up Subaru, and the first time he came to dinner at my Oakland house, he spent 20 minutes asking me detailed questions about security architecture. I liked him immediately. The cabin became our place, Clara's and mine. Somewhere we went once a month just to disconnect and remember what mattered. Sometimes Marcus came too. Sometimes it was just us, mother and daughter, cooking simple meals and talking about everything and nothing. One Sunday afternoon, almost a year after the crisis, Clara and I were sitting on the porch when she said, "I've been thinking about that gala. The one you weren't invited to." "Ancient history," I said. "I keep thinking about who was actually there that night. All those investors and strategic partners and people who were supposed to matter. And when everything fell apart, when the system crashed and the data leaked and the company was in real trouble, do you know how many of them stayed to help? How many? 3. Out of 200 guests, 3 people stayed. Everyone else left as fast as they could, distancing themselves from the disaster. But the people who actually showed up to fix things, the engineers I'd ignored, the early employees I'd taken for granted, and you, the person I'd literally uninvited because I was ashamed of how ordinary you were. You weren't ready to hear it then, but I'll say it now. The people worth impressing are the ones who show up when things get hard. Everyone else is just audience." She nodded slowly. Ethan used to say that perception is reality, that if you control how people see you, you control everything. And now Now I think reality is reality, and trying to control perception just means you're always performing, always anxious, always one mistake away from being exposed as human. I reached over and squeezed her hand. Being human isn't exposure, sweetheart, it's just the truth. The tech press eventually covered the Nova Dynamics crisis, of course, but the narrative that emerged wasn't the one Ethan had tried to create. Instead, the story became about a company that faced disaster, took responsibility, and rebuilt itself with integrity. Clara did interviews where she spoke honestly about her mistakes, about the pressure to chase growth over sustainability, about the importance of valuing substance over style. Some other CEOs mocked her for it, said she was being naive, that in Silicon Valley you had to play the game or get played. But a surprising number reached out privately, thanking her for her honesty, admitting they felt the same pressure, the same shame about not being polished or perfect enough. One young founder, a woman who just raised her Series A, called Clara after reading an interview. "My investors want me to hire a COO who looks more traditional," she said. "More CEO-like," they said. "I think they mean older, male, white. Someone who fits their idea of what leadership looks like." "What do you want to do?" Clara asked. "I want to tell them that I'm CEO-like because I'm the CEO. But I'm scared they'll pull their funding." "They might," Clara said honestly. "But funding from people who don't respect you isn't actually support. It's just delayed betrayal. I learned that the hard way." The woman ended up keeping her position and her authentic leadership style. Half her investors walked. She found new ones who valued what she brought to the table. Last I heard, her company was thriving. Clara started speaking at conferences. Not the big glamorous ones, but smaller, more intimate gatherings of founders and engineers who were trying to build companies the right way. She talked about failure, about shame, about the cost of chasing image over integrity. The talks weren't slick or perfectly delivered, but they were honest. And people responded to that honesty like they'd been starving for it. I watched her become herself again, or maybe become herself for the first time, the person she'd been trying to be, the polished, perfect CEO that had been a costume. This version, the one who wore jeans to board meetings sometimes, and admitted when she didn't know something, and valued her team's expertise over her own ego. This was the real Clara. The company changed too. We instituted policies about work-life balance, about mental health, about making space for people to have lives outside their jobs. We lost some of the hustle culture types who thought that sleeping under your desk was a badge of honor. But we kept the people who were in it for the long haul, who wanted to build something meaningful rather than just something big. 2 years after the crisis, Nova Dynamics was acquired by a larger tech company that valued our approach to ethical AI and secure systems. The acquisition was smaller than what Clara might have gotten if we'd kept chasing hypergrowth, but it was respectable, and it came with guarantees that our team would stay intact and our values would be preserved. Clara and I both had more money than we'd ever need. She used some of hers to start a foundation supporting women engineers who were being pushed out of companies they'd helped build. I used some of mine to buy a second cabin near the first one, this one for hosting retreats for engineers who needed space to remember why they got into this work in the first place. We still worked together, but differently now. Clara ran the foundation. I did consulting for nonprofits and taught occasional workshops on system security. We collaborated on projects sometimes, but we also had our own separate professional lives, our own identities beyond mother and daughter, beyond founder and co-founder. The shame Clara had felt about me, about where she came from, about being ordinary in a world that worshipped exceptional, that took longer to fully heal. There were still moments when I could see her tense up at events, worried about how she appeared, whether she was impressive enough. But those moments became less frequent, and she got better at catching herself, at remembering that the people worth knowing didn't need her to be perfect. One evening, 5 years after the crisis, Clara brought Marcus to the cabin. They'd gotten engaged and they wanted to have the wedding there, small and intimate, just family and close friends. No investors. I teased. God, no, Clara said, laughing. Just people we actually care about. People who'd help us move furniture. Not just show up for the party. The wedding was perfect in its imperfection. We set up chairs in the clearing near the cabin, hung simple decorations, made food ourselves with help from friends. Clara wore a dress she loved rather than a designer gown. Marcus wore a suit but forgot to pack dress shoes, so he got married in his hiking boots. When the caterer's van broke down halfway up the mountain, we all piled into cars and went into town for pizza. It was chaotic and unplanned and absolutely real. And watching Clara laugh through it all, unbothered by the imperfections, even enjoying them, I felt something in my chest loosen completely. The daughter I'd raised, the one who valued substance and honesty and real connection, she was fully back. During the reception, Clara stood up to give a toast. She looked at me across the crowded cabin, her eyes bright. Most people thank their parents for believing in them, she said. But I need to thank my mom for something different. For staying true to herself even when I was ashamed of that truth. For being ordinary in the most extraordinary way. For showing me that the real world, the one without polish or pretense, that's the only world worth living in. She paused, her voice catching. I spent years trying to be someone impressive, someone worth looking at. And the whole time, the person I should have been looking at, learning from, being proud to be associated with, she was right there, being herself, being real, being brave enough to be ordinary. So this toast is for everyone here who's ever been told they're not enough. Not polished enough, not perfect enough, not impressive enough for someone else's world. You are enough. The real you, the ordinary you, the you that shows up in hiking boots when you forgot dress shoes. That's the only you worth being. Everyone raised their glasses. And I sat there, watching my daughter, thinking about the long, strange journey we'd taken to get here. The success, the betrayal, the crisis, the slow, careful rebuilding. All of it necessary, all of it painful, all of it worth it to arrive at this moment. Later that night, after the guests had left and Clara and Marcus had gone to bed in the main cabin, I sat on the porch alone, watching the stars. I thought about the person I'd been 6 years ago, starting a company in my garage with my brilliant daughter. I thought about the person I'd been when they pushed me out, hurt and ashamed, and trying to convince myself it was fine. I thought about the person I'd become in the years since, someone who'd learned that being dismissed didn't mean being wrong, that being excluded didn't mean being worthless. If I could go back and tell that earlier version of myself anything, it would be this. The people who make you feel ordinary are usually the people most afraid of their own ordinariness. They need you to be less so they can feel like more. And the moment you refuse to shrink, the moment you step away from their false world of polish and pretense, that's when you discover your actual size. You were never too ordinary. Their world was just too small. The next morning, Clara and Marcus left for their honeymoon, a hiking trip through Patagonia with terrible cell service and no Wi-Fi. Before they left, Clara hugged me tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me even when I gave up on you." "That's not how being a mother works," I said. "You don't get to fire me just because I'm inconvenient." She laughed and cried at the same time, then climbed into Marcus's beat up Subaru and drove away. I spent the rest of the week at the cabin, cleaning up from the wedding, enjoying the silence, thinking about what came next. I was 62 now, old enough to retire if I wanted to, young enough to still have plenty of good years ahead. I decided I wanted to teach. Not a university, too much politics and prestige chasing there, but maybe workshops, mentoring programs, spaces where I could share what I'd learned with people who were hungry to learn it. Especially women, especially older women, especially women who'd been told they were too ordinary, too real, too human for the shiny, perfect worlds being built around them. Because here's what I'd learned, what I wanted to pass on, there's no such thing as too ordinary. Ordinary is where all the real work happens. Ordinary is where things get built and problems get solved and relationships get maintained. The extraordinary moments, the ones that look impressive from the outside, those are just the visible peaks of mountains built from ordinary effort, ordinary dedication, ordinary showing up day after day after day. And if someone ever tells you you're too ordinary for their world, don't shrink to fit their illusion. Don't sand down your edges or polish away your rough spots or pretend to be someone sleeker and shinier and less real. Step away, because when their false world collapses, and it will collapse, because worlds built on illusion always do, they'll remember who taught them how to rebuild. They'll remember who stayed real while everyone else was performing. They'll remember that ordinary was another word for honest, and honest was another word for strong. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. Just a photo, no words. The photo showed her and Marcus at the airport, both grinning, wearing matching ridiculous tourist hats they'd clearly just bought at a gift shop. Behind them, through the terminal windows, mountains were visible in the distance. She looked happy. Not the polished, performative happiness of her CEO publicity photos, but the messy, unself-conscious happiness of someone who'd stopped worrying about how they appeared and started actually living. I smiled and set the phone down. The morning was cool, the kind of crystalline autumn air that makes everything feel possible. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the way the light moved through the pine trees, thinking about all the ordinary mornings I'd spent exactly like this. How I'd once thought I needed to be doing something more impressive, something more important. How long it had taken me to understand that this quiet presence, this unwitnessed contentment, this was the thing worth protecting. A car came up the access road around 10, which surprised me. The cabin was remote enough that visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. The car was a rental, unfamiliar. A woman got out, maybe 40, dressed in business casual that looked uncomfortable on her, like she was wearing someone else's clothes. She stood by her car for a moment, looking uncertain, then saw me on the porch and waved tentatively. "Julia Whitfield," she called. "That's me." She approached slowly, like she wasn't sure of her welcome. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I'm Sarah Chen. I work for a startup in Seattle, or I did until yesterday. I read an article about you and Clara, about Nova Dynamics and what happened, about how you were pushed out and then came back and saved everything. I've read everything I could find about you over the past few weeks." She stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking exhausted and a little desperate. "The thing is, something similar just happened to me. I founded a company 3 years ago, biotech, cancer research applications. We were doing good work, real work. Then investors came in with their Series B funding, and suddenly I was too technical, too detail-oriented, not visionary enough. They wanted a CEO who could inspire people, which apparently meant someone who looked better in photos and said the right buzzwords." I gestured to the chair beside me. "Sit down. You want coffee?" "God, yes." I went inside and poured her a cup, giving her a moment to collect herself. When I came back out, she was staring at the trees with an expression I recognized. The look of someone who'd been moving too fast for too long and had finally, forcibly, stopped. "They brought in a new CEO 2 months ago," she continued when I handed her the coffee. "Someone with a track record of successful exits, lots of connections, perfect at networking. He immediately started changing our research priorities, chasing applications that would generate buzz rather than the ones that would actually help patients." I pushed back. The board said I was being difficult, not a team player, too attached to my original vision. She laughed bitterly. "My original vision. The thing I started the company for." "Let me guess," I said. "Yesterday they asked for your resignation." "Oh, worse. They restructured me into an advisory role, no real authority. Just there to make it look like they valued the founder." Optics. I told them they could keep their advisory role and their stock options. I walked out. She looked at me with something between hope and desperation. I don't know why I'm here. I read that you do consulting now, mentoring. I thought maybe you'd know what to do. How to fight this. How to get back what's mine. I sipped my coffee, choosing my words carefully. First question. Do you want to fight to get back into that company, or do you want to figure out what comes next? She stopped. I don't know. I built that company. It's mine, or it was. It's not anymore, I said, not unkindly. The moment they brought in outside money, the moment the board had more power than you did, it stopped being yours. That's the trade off of venture capital. You get resources, they get control. Most founders don't realize how real that trade is until it's too late, So I should just give up, let them destroy everything I built. Maybe they will destroy it. Maybe they'll run it into the ground chasing short-term gains and flashy applications. Or maybe they'll surprise you and actually succeed. But either way, it's not your company anymore. Trying to fight your way back into a place that doesn't want you isn't strength. It's just a different kind of giving up. She looked at me with the kind of anger that comes from hearing a truth you don't want to accept. So what was the point of you saving Nova Dynamics, if you believe companies aren't worth fighting for? I didn't save Nova Dynamics because I wanted my company back, I said. I saved it because client data was exposed and people were being hurt. I saved it because my daughter was in over her head and needed help, and whatever our problems were, I wasn't going to watch her drown. But the company, the corporate entity, I didn't care about that. I cared about the people and the principles. I leaned back in my chair. Here's what nobody tells you about being pushed out of something you built. It feels like death. Like part of you is being amputated. But sometimes the amputation saves the rest of you. Sometimes the thing you built becomes toxic, and the only way to survive is to cut it loose and let it go. That's easy to say when you ended up back on top, Sarah said, when you got a happy ending. It's not a happy ending, it's just an ending. Clara and I rebuilt our relationship, yes. I got vindication, sure. But Nova Dynamics, we sold it. It's not ours anymore, not in any meaningful way. The mission we started with, the values we wanted to build around, those got absorbed into a bigger company with its own priorities. Some of what we cared about survived. A lot of it didn't. I watched a bird land on the porch railing, tilt its head at us, then fly away. The question you need to ask yourself isn't how to get back what you lost. It's what you want to build with what you have left. Which is considerable, by the way. You have expertise, experience, knowledge about what works and what doesn't. 3 years of learning what cancer research actually needs versus what sounds impressive to investors. No funding. No team. Not yet. But Sarah, the best work often comes from people who've been pushed out of the mainstream and forced to figure out alternative paths. You don't need the same kind of funding those guys are chasing. There are grants, nonprofit structures, university partnerships. There are ways to do meaningful research without playing the venture capital game. She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup. I'm so angry, she finally said. At them at the board at myself for letting it happen. Good. Stay angry for a while. Anger is clarifying. It shows you what you actually care about. Just don't let it calcify into bitterness. Don't let it convince you that, because this one thing didn't work out the way you wanted, nothing ever will. How long did it take you to stop being angry? I smiled. I'll let you know when it happens. I'm not bitter anymore, but angry. That comes and goes. Usually when I read about some other woman getting pushed out of a company she built by men who think vision means ignoring details and leadership means looking good in photos. Sarah laughed, surprised. So you never get over it completely. Why would you want to? That anger, properly channeled, is fuel. It reminds you what you're fighting against, what needs to change. The trick is not letting it poison you, not letting it become the only thing you feel. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while. Sarah seemed less desperate now, more thoughtful. The frantic energy she'd arrived with had settled into something more grounded. "Can I ask you something personal?" she finally said. "You showed up at my cabin unannounced. I think we're past worrying about personal. When Clara told you that you weren't good enough for her new world, when she uninvited you from the gala, how did you not just write her off? How did you forgive that?" I thought about it. I didn't forgive it right away. I was hurt, deeply hurt. But I also understood that she wasn't really rejecting me. She was rejecting herself, the parts of herself that reminded her of me. She was terrified of being seen as ordinary, as unglamorous, as someone who built things in garages instead of corner offices. That doesn't make it okay. No, it doesn't. But it makes it understandable. And understanding doesn't mean condoning. It just means seeing the whole person, not just the hurt they caused. Clara was 28 when we started Nova Dynamics, 34 when she pushed me out. She was brilliant but young, hungry but insecure. She got seduced by a world that valued all the wrong things, and she made terrible choices because of it. I refilled both our coffee cups. But people aren't their worst choices. They're not their best choices either. They're the sum of everything, and they're also always capable of change. Clara changed. She had to fail spectacularly first, had to lose almost everything, but she changed. She became someone I'm proud to know, not just proud to have raised. And if she hadn't changed, if she'd stayed that person who was ashamed of you, then I would have grieved and moved on. You can love someone and still choose not to be in their life if they're toxic to your well-being. But I would have given her the space to possibly change, because that's what you do for people you love. You don't enable their bad behavior, but you don't close the door completely either. Sarah nodded slowly. The CEO they brought in to replace me, he was my mentor once. Years ago, when I was first starting out in biotech. He taught me about grant writing, about navigating academic politics. I admired him so much. And now I feel betrayed. He knew what this company meant to me. He knew the research we were doing, how important it was. And he took the job anyway, took it knowing he'd be pushing me out. Did you tell him how you felt? No, I just left. Cut off all contact. Maybe you should tell him, not to change anything, not expecting an apology or reconciliation. But for yourself. So you're not carrying around unexpressed hurt. She looked doubtful. What good would that do? Might do nothing. Might do everything. But unexpressed hurt has a way of rotting inside you, turning into resentment, cynicism. The kind of bitterness that poisons everything you try to build next. You don't have to forgive him. You don't have to maintain a relationship. But you might need to say your piece for your own clarity. We talked for another hour about her research, about possible next steps, about the nonprofit research model and how it differed from the startup world. I gave her names of people to contact, foundations that funded alternative cancer research approaches, universities that might be interested in partnerships. By the time she left, she looked different. Still hurt, still angry, but no longer desperate. Like she could see a path forward, even if it wasn't the path she'd originally imagined. "Thank you," she said as she got back in her rental car. "For the advice, and for not telling me to just get over it or move on." "Moving on is overrated," I said. "Moving forward while carrying what you've learned, that's the real work." After she left, I sat back down on the porch and thought about all the other Sarah Chens out there. Women who'd built things and been pushed aside. People who'd been told they were too ordinary, too technical, too detail-oriented, too whatever for the shiny perfect worlds they'd helped create. I pulled out my phone and started making notes. Ideas for workshops, for a mentoring program, for a network of people who'd been through similar experiences. Not a support group, exactly, though there'd be support in it. More like a resource hub, a way of connecting people who knew how to rebuild with people, who were just figuring out that rebuilding was possible. Clara called that evening from a hotel in Buenos Aires. "How was the wedding cleanup?" she asked. "Fine, but I had an interesting visitor this morning." I told her about Sarah Chen, about the conversation we'd had. Clara listened quietly, then said, "You should do it. The mentoring program, the network. You're good at this, Mom. At helping people see past their immediate crisis to what comes next." I'm 62. I should probably be thinking about retirement, not starting new projects. Says who? Some imaginary rule book about what people your age are supposed to do. You're the one who taught me that ordinary was just another word for honest. Maybe ordinary 62-year-olds are supposed to retire and play golf, but you were never ordinary in that way. I smiled. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. She just took me a while to listen to her. After we hung up, I sat there with my laptop, roughing out ideas. A website, maybe, with resources and contact information. Monthly virtual meetups for people navigating similar transitions. A database of alternative funding sources for founders who'd been pushed out but wanted to continue their work. Maybe eventually in-person retreats. Here at the cabin, space for people to step away from the chaos and think clearly about what came next. The more I wrote, the more excited I became. This felt right in a way that consulting for corporations never had. This was about helping people who'd been dismissed, overlooked, told they weren't enough. Helping them see that being pushed out of one world just meant the opportunity to build a better one. Over the next few months, the project took shape. I called it Ordinary Founders, partly as a joke, partly as a reclamation of the word that had been used as a weapon against so many of us. Clara helped with the website design, keeping it simple and functional rather than flashy. Marcus helped with the back-end infrastructure, making sure it was secure and reliable. Word spread quietly, mostly through personal connections and word of mouth. Sarah Chen became one of the first members, and she brought other biotech founders who'd had similar experiences. A man who'd been pushed out of a clean energy startup. A woman who'd founded an educational technology company and been replaced by someone with better investor connections. Two colleagues who'd co-founded a healthcare company and been systematically marginalized by the board that assembled. We had our first virtual meetup in December, just 8 people on a video call, everyone a little awkward and uncertain. But within 15 minutes, the awkwardness dissolved into recognition. These were people who'd been through the same thing, felt the same shame and anger and confusion. They understood each other in ways that people who hadn't been through it never quite could. One founder, a man named James, who'd built a successful educational nonprofit before being forced out by his own board, said something that stuck with everyone. I kept thinking I was the only one. That I must have done something wrong, been too difficult or too inflexible or too something. Hearing all your stories, I realize this is systemic. It's not about individual failures. It's about a system that values certain kinds of people and certain kinds of leadership and pushes out everyone who doesn't fit that narrow mold. So what do we do about it? Someone asked. We build different systems, I said. We fund each other, mentor each other, create alternative paths that don't require us to compromise our values or pretend to be someone we're not. We prove that the ordinary way, the honest way, the way that prioritizes substance over style, that works too. Maybe it's slower. Maybe it's less flashy. But it's sustainable. By the end of the call, we'd scheduled monthly meetups and started a shared document of resources. People volunteered to lead different initiatives. One on alternative funding sources, another on governance structures that protected founders, a third on mental health resources for people going through transitions. It felt like the beginning of something real. Clara came back from her honeymoon tanned and relaxed, full of stories about hiking in Patagonia and getting lost on mountain trails and sleeping in tents under impossible stars. She and Marcus drove straight to Oakland to have dinner with me before heading back to their apartment in the city. So, she said over the pasta I'd made, tell me about Ordinary Founders. How many members now? 23 as of this morning, including you if you want to officially join. She looked surprised. I wasn't pushed out. I'm the one who did the pushing. You were still harmed by the same system, I said. You were still told that who you naturally were wasn't good enough, that you needed to be polished and perfect and distant to be taken seriously. You still had to fail and rebuild. Different path to the same lesson. She considered this. Can I think about it? Of course. But a week later, she sent me her membership form, filled out honestly. Under what happened, she'd written, I pushed out the person who taught me everything because I was ashamed of being ordinary. Then I almost destroyed the company, trying to be impressive instead of effective. Currently learning that the best version of myself was there all along. We held our first in-person retreat at the cabin in March, 8 people for a long weekend. I'd worried it might be awkward, strangers forced together in close quarters. But something about the setting, the simplicity of it, the way the cabin insisted on slowing down and being present, it worked. We cooked meals together, simple food that required cooperation. We hiked in the mornings, giving people space to think and move. In the afternoons, we sat in a circle and talked through whatever people wanted to discuss. Technical challenges, emotional processing, strategic planning for what came next. One woman, Linda, had been pushed out of a fashion company she'd founded 20 years earlier. I'm 68, she said. Everyone keeps telling me I should be relieved, that I should enjoy my retirement, travel, spend time with grandchildren. But I don't want to retire. I still have ideas, energy, things I want to build. I just don't want to build them in a system that values youth over experience. Don't, said Maria, who'd been forced out of a restaurant group she'd built over 15 years. Build in a different system. Or build your own system. I'd 68. Who's going to take me seriously? Use, I said, on anyone else who values substance over appearance. The world is full of people who are tired of youth worship, tired of pretending that inexperience somehow equals innovation. There's a market for what you know, what you've learned. You just have to stop trying to appeal to people who don't value it and start finding the people who do. By the end of the weekend, Linda had the outline of a new venture, a consulting firm specifically for established companies who wanted to avoid the mistakes that come from chasing trends instead of building lasting value. She paired up with 2 other retreat participants, both with decades of experience in different industries, and started planning. That was the pattern that emerged over the months that followed. People would arrive hurt and uncertain, convinced their careers were over, that they'd failed in some fundamental way. And they'd leave with plans, with partnerships, with a renewed sense that being ordinary, being honest, being substantial, these weren't weaknesses. They were exactly what the world needed more of. Clara started attending the virtual meetups, usually sitting quietly, listening more than talking. But occasionally she'd share something about her own experience, about the pressure to perform, about the loneliness of pretending to be someone you're not. One evening, after a particularly intense meetup where a young founder had broken down crying about being replaced by someone the board felt was more mature, Clara stayed on the call after everyone else had logged off. I don't think I've ever actually apologized, she said. Not properly. For uninviting you to the gala, for being ashamed of you, for all of it got. You've apologized many times. No, I've said I'm sorry, but I haven't really acknowledged what I did, the full scope of it. I didn't just hurt you in that moment. I hurt you for years, with every impatient comment, every time I suggested you weren't professional enough, every subtle and not so subtle message that who you were wasn't good enough. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face on the video screen. You taught me everything. How to code, how to think through problems, how to build things that actually worked instead of just looking impressive. And I repaid you by treating you like an embarrassment, like someone I needed to hide to protect my image. Clara. No, let me finish. I need to say this. You were never too ordinary. I was too afraid. Afraid of being seen as someone who came from ordinary beginnings. Afraid of being associated with anything that wasn't perfectly polished. afraid that, if people looked too closely, they'd see that I was just a regular person who got lucky, not some exceptional genius who deserved all the attention and success. She wiped her eyes. And the most fucked up part is that the version of me I was trying to be, the impressive one, the exceptional one, she almost destroyed everything. It was the ordinary version, the one who learned from her mother how to actually solve problems. Instead of just talking about solving them, that version was the one worth being all along. I waited until she'd finished, until the tears had slowed. Clara, you were 28 when we started the company. 28. Do you know what I was like at 28? I was insecure and eager to please and absolutely convinced that I had to be exceptional to matter. I made different mistakes than you did, but I made plenty. The only difference is that most of mine weren't public, weren't witnessed by investors and journalists and the whole tech world. That doesn't excuse what I did. No, it doesn't. But it contextualizes it. You were young, you were under enormous pressure, you were surrounded by people telling you that image mattered more than substance. You made bad choices, you hurt people, hurt me especially, but you learned, you changed, you became someone better. That's all any of us can do. She nodded, still crying a little. I'm trying to figure out how to live with having been that person. How to integrate it, not deny it but not be defined by it either, Gar. That's exactly what you should be doing. Own it, learn from it, use it to help other people avoid the same mistakes. That's how shame transforms into wisdom. After we hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about transformation, about how people change. Clara had gone from being ashamed of ordinariness to embracing it, from valuing image over substance to prioritizing the reverse. But it hadn't been a clean linear progression. It had been messy, painful, full of backsliding and breakthroughs and moments of doubt. That was real change. Not a single dramatic moment of revelation, but a slow accumulation of choices, each one slightly better than the last, until suddenly you looked back and realized you'd become someone different. The first year of Ordinary Founders exceeded anything I'd imagined. We grew to over 100 members, held quarterly retreats, established a small grant fund for founders starting new ventures without venture capital. Several members collaborated on new projects. Others found renewed purpose in adjacent fields, taking their expertise in directions they'd never considered before. But the most meaningful moments weren't the growth metrics or the success stories. They were quieter, like the email I got from Sarah Chen, 18 months after she'd shown up at my cabin, telling me she'd secured a major research grant and was setting up a nonprofit lab focused on the cancer research she'd always wanted to do. Like the video call with a 55-year-old founder who'd been told she was too old to understand social media, and who just launched a successful app for seniors. Like watching people shed the shame they'd been carrying and step into their actual competence. Clara got more involved with Ordinary Founders over time, eventually joining the advisory board. She brought a perspective I couldn't, having been on the other side of the push out. Having been the person who did the marginalizing before experiencing her own version of it. She was honest about her mistakes in ways that gave other young founders permission to question the pressure they were under. One afternoon, 2 years after the Nova Dynamics crisis, Clara and I were working together on a presentation for an upcoming retreat when she said, "You know what's weird? I'm happier now than I ever was when I was supposedly successful. Back then, when everyone was telling me I was impressive, when I was on magazine covers and giving keynotes, I was miserable. Anxious all the time, never feeling good enough, always performing. And now I'm just doing work that matters with people I respect. Marcus and I have a small apartment, no fancy car, no designer clothes. We cook dinner together most nights, we take long walks. We have actual conversations instead of networking, and I feel more successful than I ever did when I was supposedly winning. That's because you're living according to your own values now, instead of someone else's definition of success." She smiled. Your definition of success, you mean? The one you tried to teach me and I was too stubborn to hear, Daw. Well, you're hearing it now. That's what matters. We worked in comfortable silence for a while. The kind of easy companionship that comes from having weathered hard things together and come out intact on the other side. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Coming to Oakland for dinner tonight. Making my famous tacos. Be there or be square. I laughed and showed Clara the message. Your husband is ridiculous. I know. It's one of his best qualities. They came over that evening, arms full of groceries, and took over my kitchen with cheerful chaos. Marcus told terrible jokes while chopping vegetables. Clara argued with him about the proper ratio of lime to cilantro. I sat at the counter with a glass of wine, watching them, feeling something warm and settled in my chest. This was the life that mattered. Not the impressive moments, not the public successes or the magazine profiles. Just this people you loved, making food together, laughing over nothing important, being completely and unself-consciously present. After dinner, we sat in my small backyard as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus asked about my mother, who was 92 now and still sharp as ever in her assisted living facility in Portland. Clara told stories about the foundation, about young women engineers she was mentoring who reminded her of herself at that age, minus the crippling insecurity. Speaking of which, Clara said, I have something to tell you both. She looked nervous, excited, scared. Marcus reached over and took her hand. We're pregnant, she said. 12 weeks. We wanted to wait until we were past the risky period to tell people. I stood up and pulled her into a hug, feeling tears spring to my eyes. Oh, sweetheart, congratulations. I'm terrified, she admitted. What if I mess it up? What if I pass on all my issues about success and image and not being good enough? You will mess it up, I said. All parents do. But you'll also do a lot of things right. And unlike me, you've already worked through a lot of your issues. Your child won't help you learn the lessons you've already learned the hard way. That's oddly reassuring. Good. It was meant to be. We stayed up late that night, talking about plans and fears and hopes. Clara asked me about my pregnancy with her, about what I'd been scared of, what I'd been excited about. I told her about being 32 and convinced I was too old to be a first-time mother, about the terror of holding her for the first time and realizing I was responsible for keeping this tiny human alive. Did you know what you were doing? Clara asked. Not even a little bit. I figured it out as I went, which is what everyone does, despite what parenting books try to tell you. What if I work too much? What if I become one of those parents who's always distracted, always checking their phone? Then you'll notice and adjust. That's the thing about parenting. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present enough to notice when you're screwing up and care enough to do better. Marcus smiled. Julia, you're going to be an amazing grandmother. Ah, grandmother. The word landed with unexpected weight. I was going to be someone's grandmother. There would be a small human who would grow up knowing me not as a founder or engineer or mentor, but as grandma. Someone who would learn about the world through my eyes, who would be shaped in small ways by my presence. It felt like a responsibility and a gift all at once. Over the next months, as Clara's pregnancy progressed, I found myself thinking about legacy differently. Not about what I'd built professionally, though that mattered, but about what I'd passed on to Clara and what she'd passed on to her child, and how values and priorities ripple out through generations. I wanted this child, my grandchild, to grow up knowing that ordinary was enough. That you didn't have to be exceptional or impressive or remarkable. That showing up honestly, doing good work, caring about substance over image, treating people with respect regardless of their status or usefulness to you, that was the real measure of a life well lived. Clara went into labor on a Thursday evening in September. I met them at the hospital and spent the next 14 hours in the waiting room, alternating between excited pacing and nervous napping. Marcus came out every few hours with updates, looking progressively more exhausted and exhilarated. Finally, at 6 in the morning, he emerged with tears streaming down his face. "It's a girl. Everyone's healthy. Clara's asking for you." I followed him to the recovery room, where Clara lay propped up in bed, looking destroyed and radiant all at once. And in her arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket, was the smallest person I'd ever seen. "Mom," Clara said softly, "meet Emma Julia Whitfield Chen." She held out the bundle, and I took my granddaughter in my arms for the first time. Emma had Clara's dark hair, already thick despite being brand new. Her eyes were closed, her face scrunched in an expression of deep concentration. She was perfect and ordinary and absolutely remarkable. "Hey, Emma," I whispered. "I'm your grandma. I'm going to teach you so many things, including that it's perfectly fine to be ordinary. Your mama had to learn that the hard way, but we're going to make sure you know it from the beginning." Clara laughed, tired and happy. "Among other things, Mom. Maybe also some actual practical skills. Those too. But the ordinary thing first. That's the foundation everything else builds on." I stayed at the hospital for a few hours, holding Emma while Clara slept, watching this tiny new person exist in the world. She was so vulnerable, so completely dependent, so absolutely herself already despite being only hours old. When I finally left to let them rest, I drove back to Oakland in the early morning light, feeling something shift inside me. A sense of continuity, of purpose extending beyond my own life. Emma would grow up in a different world than Clara had, than I had. But some truths remained constant. The importance of honesty, the value of showing up, the strength in being unashamedly ordinary. I thought about the long, strange journey that had brought me here, building a company and losing it, being pushed aside and learning to find power in that marginalization. Watching my daughter reject everything I'd taught her and then, through painful failure, learn it all over again for herself. Starting over at 60, building something new from the ruins of old disappointments. If someone had told me 6 years ago, when I was being pushed out of Nova Dynamics, that this was where I'd end up, I wouldn't have believed them. Or maybe I would have thought it sounded like failure. Smaller, quieter, less impressive than staying on as co-founder of a successful startup. But now, I knew better. This wasn't smaller, it was deeper. It wasn't less impressive, it was more real. I pulled up to my house in Oakland, the same house I'd lived in for 30 years, the same house where I'd started Nova Dynamics in the garage, where I'd raised Clara, where I'd cried when they pushed me out, and where I'd slowly rebuilt my sense of self. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, not impressive by Silicon Valley standards. But it was mine, fully paid off, full of memories and meaning. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything. If someone ever tells you you're too ordinary for their world, don't shrink to fit their illusion, step away. Because when their false world collapses, they'll remember who taught them how to rebuild. This is a story from Stories of Aria, where we celebrate the ordinary moments that change everything, the quiet courage that builds real success, and the people who choose substance over shine. Because the most extraordinary lives are often the ones that look most ordinary from the outside.